Wayside School, Cloud of Doom, Kajuka, Boop. The ultimate test was over, and nobody was sent back to kindergarten. Mrs. Jules had made up the test so that every one of her students had a chance to shine using his or her special talent. Anyone with nail clippings? She asked. Myron came in the front of the room and dropped 37 nail clippings to the nail bucket. 19 came from toes and 18 from fingers. He started to do the math on the board. 999,962 plus 37 equals 9. He was suddenly startled by a very loud kachuga boop. He dropped the chalk. This was a bell nobody in class had heard before, not even Mrs. Jules. Then came another kachuga, followed by 2 boops. "What's it mean, Mrs. Jules?" shouted Leslie. "Everybody keep calm," said Mrs. Jules. "Kachuga boop, boop, boop." Mrs. Jules hurried to the back closet. It started up again. Kachuga boop, boop, boop. Mrs. Jules threw open the closet door and started tossing books and supplies out of the way. Kachuga boop, boop, boop. She finally removed a very large book covered with dust. "The Complete Guide to Bells," said Terence, reading the book's title over Mrs. Jules' shoulder. Mrs. Jules sat on the floor, turning the pages until she got to the index. The kachuga booping continued, making it difficult for her to concentrate. She found it. Kachuga boop, page 297. She quickly turned to that page. Suddenly, a loud boom shook the room. The lights went out. This time, nobody screamed. They were too scared. Mrs. Jules lit a candle. In the flickering light, she read aloud from page 297. "If you hear a kachuga followed by 1, 2, and then 3 boops, you should—" She stopped and blew a cloud of dust off the page, then tried to find where she had left off. 1, 2, and then 3 boops. "You should run for your lives. A cloud of doom is about to destroy everything." She dropped the book. "Everybody outside," she ordered. Another boom shook the classroom so hard that the clock fell off the wall. The children ran to the door, but it wouldn't open. "The paperclip closet must have fallen over," said Damien. "It's blocking the door." "Paperclip closet?" asked Miss Jules. She glared at Jason. "Sorry," he said. Jason couldn't keep a secret. Todd, Marisha, Damien, and Allison all pushed together, but the door wouldn't budge. "Let Stephen in there," urged Kathy. "He's been doing all those push-downs." With Stephen's help, they pushed the door open. Sirens wailed from the closet, which lay on the ground. A smoke screen filled the area. In the light of Miss Jules' candle, they could see that the chains and steel bar had been shattered. Paper clips were strewn all over the floor. Benjamin and Rondi started picking them up. "Leave them!" shouted Mrs. Jules. Now they knew it was serious. Mrs. Jules told everyone to hold hands as they led the way down the staircase. Paul grabbed Leslie's pigtail. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "It's either that or your hand," he said. "Okay," Leslie agreed. The kachuga booping continued as more loud booms shook the classroom. A gust of wind blew out Miss Jules' candle, and the class continued down in darkness. Joe stepped on a skateboard which somebody had left in the middle of the stairs. He fell, pulling John down with him. Who pulled down Dana? Who pulled down Jenny? Who pulled down Rondi? Who pulled down Terence? The chain reaction ended with Damien pulling down Mrs. Jules. The class lay sprawled across the stairs as the school shook around them. "We're doomed!" Mac wailed. "Look!" exclaimed Bibi. A door had opened, and there was a light coming from inside a classroom. A teacher stood in the doorway. "Quick, come inside," she beckoned. "You'll be safe here." She had a long fingernail on her pinky. Chapter 28. The teacher with the long fingernail. Like moths, the children went to the light. "Welcome, welcome. Glad you're here. Come in," the woman said as they filed past and joined the other kids in her class. "I'm sorry I don't have enough desks, but we'll make do. Please find a place on the floor for now." The children did as they were told. They felt safe, even if a bit uncomfortable. They could no longer feel the school shake or hear the kachuga boops. "Mrs. Zarves," said Mrs. Jules, "it's so good to see you. How long has it been?" "Oh, it feels like forever," said Mrs. Zarves. "I never bump into you in the teacher's lounge," said Miss Jules. "We must just keep missing each other." I try not to bump into people, said Mrs. Arves. Mrs. Arves was tall and thin. Her skirt and blouse were neat and trim. Her short hair looked shiny and silky and smelled like strawberry shampoo. Everything about her was neat and orderly except for that one fingernail. "And how's Mavis?" said Miss Jarves. Mavis was Mrs. Jewell's daughter. "Oh, adorable," said Miss Jewels. "But they grow up so fast, don't they?" "I wouldn't know," said Miss Arves. "You don't look like you've aged a day," said Mrs. Jewels. "Very nice of you to say," said Miss Arves. Miss Jewels wasn't just being nice. Mrs. Arves hadn't changed one bit, except for her fingernail, of course, which had grown considerably longer. Calvin walked between the two teachers. "Excuse me, Mrs. Arves," he said. "I think I'm supposed to give you this." He handed Mrs. Arves a folded piece of paper that was so old it tore as Mrs. Arves unfolded it. She strained to read the faded writing. "Oh, okay," she said to Miss Jewels, then dropped the note in the trash. "Is that the note I gave you to give Mrs. Arves, Miss Jewels?" asked Calvin. Calvin shrugged. "I just found it in my pocket," he said, sounding even more surprised than Mrs. Jewels. Mrs. Jewels stared at him. "You told me you gave it to her," she accused. "I don't think I ever said that," said Calvin. Mrs. Jewels continued to stare as she returned to his seat on the floor. "We were just about to have our history review," said Mrs. Arves. "Who's your best history student?" "Myron," Miss Jewels answered without hesitation. Myron had gotten the highest score on the history portion of the ultimate test. "Myron, stand up, please," said Mrs. Arves. He stood. "What kind of shoes did Mary Bopkins like to wear?" Mrs. Arves asked him. "Who?" asked Myron. The kids from Mrs. Arves' class giggled. "No laughing," said Mrs. Arves. "We don't laugh at stupid people. Don't feel bad, Myron. You may be stupid now, but once you've been in my class for a few years, you'll know the history of everybody. Mark, would you please tell Myron the answer?" "A few years?" Myron asked, but Mrs. Arves ignored the question. Mark Miller stood up. "Which Mary Bopkins do you mean?" he asked. "The one born in 1801 in Boston, or the one born in 1954 in San Francisco?" "Boston," said Mrs. Arves. "Red boots," said Mark. "Excellent," said Mrs. Arves. "Who is Mary Bopkins?" asked Miss Jewels. "Was she famous?" "Why?" asked Mrs. Arves. "Does your class only study famous people? Do you think famous people are more important than people who aren't famous?" "But there isn't enough time to study everyone," said Miss Jewels. "We don't play favorites in my class," said Miss Arves. She went to the back closet and took out several giant stacks of papers. "This is everyone born in 1837. She went around the room, handing each student a stack of 100 pages or more. "When you finish studying a page, please pass it on to someone else." Myron stared helplessly at his stack. "I can't even read this," he complained. "I think it's Chinese." "Well, yes, a lot of people were born in China," said Miss Arves. She handed Myron a Chinese dictionary and said, "You'll need this." It is impossible to say how long Myron sat there fumbling through the dictionary as the kids around him were passing around sheets of paper. He might have been there an hour, a day, or a week. Time passes slowly when you're trying to read a Chinese dictionary. Even if you're Chinese, he glanced up and spotted a pair of scissors on Mark Miller's desk. He got an idea. "Hey, Mark, can I borrow those for a sec?" Myron asked. "Sure," said Mark. Myron took the scissors, then walked bravely to the front of the room. He didn't know if his plan would work. In fact, it really didn't make any sense, but it was his only hope. "Excuse me, Miss Arves. I can trim your fingernail for you if you'd like," he offered. "My fingernail?" asked Mrs. Arves, astonished by such a suggestion. "Which one?" "The long one on the end," said Myron. Mrs. Arves looked at her hand. Now that you mention it, it has gotten long. I guess I hadn't noticed it, because it grew so slowly." She held out her hand. Myron pressed hard on the scissors and snipped it off. "That does feel better," said Mrs. Arves. "Thank you, Myron." Myron held the fingernail up in the air. Except he was no longer standing in front of the classroom. He was standing on the stairs, and everyone else from Mrs. Jewels' class lay sprawled across the staircase. "1,000,000!" he shouted triumphantly.